Hey, welcome back. It's theory time. Today we're discussing equity planning theory, which is very much built on all of the three theories I've discussed before. I think you should go watch those videos first since I referenced them several times, but if you don't want to, then just stick around. As a reminder, I'm Josh, I'm an urban planner, and this is a series that examines all of the major theories of planning through a radical planning lens. Equity planning theory was first developed by Norman Krumholz. Krumholz received his master's in planning in 1965, which is the same year that Paul Davidoff published his paper describing advocacy planning theory. I discussed this paper, which is titled Advocacy and Pluralism in Planning, in my previous video. Krumholz was deeply impacted by Davidoff's work and sought to implement advocacy theory within the government. In doing research for this video, I found a lot of sources that conflate advocacy theory and equity theory. This might come from the fact that Krumholz himself used the terms interchangeably. Respectfully to Norm, he's wrong. They're not the same theory at all. Let's discuss what equity planning theory is first, and then we can compare it to advocacy planning theory. Krumholz became the director of planning for Cleveland, Ohio in 1969. At the time, Cleveland was facing rising income inequality and race and class segregation. With Davidoff's advocacy theory in mind, Krumholz transformed his planning department and the roles of his planners. In their 1975 paper, Krumholz and fellow staff members Janice, Cogger, and John Linner outlined the theory of equity planning that they had developed in Cleveland. First and foremost, the planning department placed priority attention to the needs of the people with the most problems and fewest opportunities. This is a pretty standard definition of equity. Equity is often defined in contrast to equality. In a system of equality, everyone has equal access to opportunities, but under equality, those who already have advantages due to their income, their race, their disability status, will achieve better outcomes from these opportunities. Equity-focused systems seek to reallocate resources so that the disadvantaged are able to achieve the same outcomes as the advantaged. In Krumholz, Cleveland, the equity focus was specifically on income. The plan's policies and programs were geared towards alleviating poverty. They included things like constructing public housing units, creating a fund to pay for repairs on decaying apartments, and providing rental assistance directly to the tenant, not the landlord. These programs were financed through tax revenue, meaning they were a redistribution of wealth from higher earners to lower earners. With the departmental objective of equitable resource distribution set, Krumholz, Cogger, and Linner noted three qualities required of any planner working in their department. Those qualities are service. Equity planners must decide that their career will be devoted to serving the disadvantaged, especially the poor in the case of the Krumholz planning department. Initiative. Equity planners must be prepared to advocate for their recommendations outside of the planning department. This means that equity planners should be ready to become political actors who speak directly to elected officials and the public. Finally, competence. Equity planners should make recommendations based on data analysis, not morals or rhetoric. Let's focus on that last one. This is the first hurdle we need to get through with equity planning. Before we talk about equity planning theory's relationship to advocacy planning, let's talk about its relationship to the first two theories of planning, rational comprehensive and incrementalism. Krumholz believed that the only way to convince politicians and the broader public to support equity programs was to use hard data, not moralistic or emotional arguments. There is no difference between equity planning theory and rational comprehensive theory in this regard. Equity planners still look at a long list of alternative courses of action and determine which one has the best outcomes through extensive data analysis. Equity theory breaks from rational comprehensive theory in that it doesn't typically pursue thresholds of success. Equity plans don't usually have numbers like pull 100 people out of poverty, for example. Rather, equity planning is perpetual. It seeks to improve equity indefinitely. This brings us to incrementalism. Equity planners often have simplified goals, like promote equity, and they seek to influence government policy to better align with that goal. The process for doing this is pretty much the same as the watchdog system developed by Lindblom in his incremental theory. Planners become the watchdogs and promote their policies to decision makers. If decision makers deny the recommendations the equity planner is making, Krumholz argued that the planner should take the good ideas in their recommendations, repackage them, and bring them back to the table. In this sense, equity planning's method of pushing policies is the same as incrementalism. However, it's important to remember that incrementalist theory rejects comprehensive planning goals. This would even include the simple goal of promote equity. Incrementalism also holds the people outside of government should be watchdogs. As a right-wing theory, it rejects the idea of government benevolence. Now let's compare it to advocacy. As I said earlier, Krumholz throughout his career conflated advocacy theory and equity theory. Perhaps he was avoiding plagiarism. Perhaps he just wanted to give his respects to Davidoff. but the theories are not that similar. For example, advocacy planning's crux is that it's pluralistic, meaning there should be several competing plans. These plans are developed by the peoples whose interests the plan serves. For example, a neighborhood would make its own plan. Next, advocacy theory itself, especially as it was conceived in the paper that inspired Krumholz, doesn't favor any one group. Advocacy planning prefers equality over equity. Everyone should make their own plan, but the government still decides which plan is adopted. The theories do align in two important ways, though. First, both theories believe that planners have their own values. Krumholz believed that planners with the value of aiding the poor should pursue equity-oriented careers. The second way is that they're both centered on the desires of the people impacted by the plan. Krumholz, like Davidoff, rejected planning that focused only on urban form. Both theories are focused on the people who inhabit a place. 6 years into developing equity planning theory through practice, the Cleveland Planning Department released what is widely considered the first equity plan, the 1975 Cleveland Policy Planning Report. In the plan, Krumholz and his staff wrote that the success of equity planning requires a clear statement of support for the disadvantaged. Under that rationale, the plan had a single goal. Equity requires that locally responsible government institutions give priority attention to the goal of promoting a wider range of choices for those Cleveland residents who have few, if any, choices. The Krumholz Planning Department saw enormous success in their 10-year run. While we're able to imitate their actions to a degree by employing equity planning theory, the specific conditions of the 1970s in Cleveland can't be overlooked. The 70s were rough. Rust Belt America was feeling the full effects of deindustrialization and depopulation. Between 1950 and 1980, Cleveland lost nearly half of its population. I think this led to a sort of growth pessimism. Certainly, Cleveland continued to try to attract capital investors, but for a brief moment, the city became concerned with its own residents. Krumholz, operating under a series of supportive mayors, was the right person in the right place at the right time. If it had been any other planning director, I doubt we would even have equity planning theory today. Without the growth imperative, Krumholz and his planners worked under the question, who gets, who pays? No longer attempting to use city funds to cater to capitalists, the Krumholz Planning Department worked to expand transit and public housing, to create beautification programs, and to generally improve the lives of the people who already lived in Cleveland. This is impressive, but you might have picked up by now that it didn't stick. The biggest problem with equity planning is that it's completely dependent on the individual planner's understanding and commitment to the theory. In this sense, it's technocratic. What I mean is that equity planning is not something that can come from the bottom up. Equity planners have to have some sort of institution of authority behind them. If the individual planner or the institution, which could be the government or nonprofits, for example, give up on equity planning, then there's just no more equity planning. The people who would benefit from increases to equity can't continue the work without that institutional authority. This is what happened in Cleveland. In 1979, Krumholz resigned from the planning department when a less enthusiastic mayor was elected. By 1982, all of Krumholz's equity staff had resigned. They were replaced with traditional growth-focused planners employing rational comprehensive theory. And most of the great achievements the planning department had made were stripped away as neoliberal austerity took hold in the 80s. Regardless of its staying power in Cleveland, equity planning theory has been totally incorporated into the mainstream. All federal funding programs require equity analyses, for example, and the American Institute of Certified Planners has incorporated the pursuit of equity into their ethics code. In my free time, I'm a radical planner, but radical planning doesn't pay the bills, so typically at work, I'm an equity planner. It can be rewarding, but I've also been exposed to unnamed horrors. See, equity is really easy to fake. I've attended hours and hours of equity seminars. Sometimes, though rarely, they're led by people who genuinely want to improve the outcomes for the disadvantaged. Most of the time, they're exercises in propaganda. For example, there was this one where a bunch of bankers showed us their pyramid scheme. They offer classes for low-income people to learn how to become real estate developers. They said this was equity because it could pull people out of poverty and into untold riches. I've sat through seminars where the speaker discusses how free labor, specifically Black-led community beautification, could be an investment opportunity, especially if their culture is on display. And one time, I was at an equity summit and the speaker said that if Sandra Bland had lived in a walkable neighborhood, she might not have died. He called for a relaxing of zoning restrictions as a solution to police violence, and I will never get over that. Because equity planning theory requires the individual to know what equity actually is, it's a very unstable form of planning. I think it's helped countless lives, and it's certainly better than nothing, but just as everything else we learned from the 2020 protests, Equity planning is corruptible, and it can just as easily serve capital. Krumholz died in 2019, but right before his death, he and Kathryn Wertheim Hexter published the book Advancing Equity Planning Now. After nearly 50 years of refining equity planning theory through the neoliberal shift, Krumholz provided his final guidelines for equity planners. First, equity planning must be oriented to the user. The planner should adopt the goals and values of the disadvantaged people they plan for. Second, the purpose of redistribution should be to allow people to have the freedom to control their own lives as long as their choices don't harm others. And third, a significant increase in economic, social, and political equity is necessary to preserve American democracy. I think these final guidelines resolve some of the issues with equity planning. These guidelines feel like they're intended to limit the technocratic nature of the theory. They're all oriented to the idea that our society should be based on freedom, and that freedom does have a monetary value. I really appreciate you watching this one. I think of all the theories we've discussed so far, equity planning is the most significant. Please like, share, and subscribe. It really helps me grow the channel. Thanks so much, and I'll see you later.